In the cold mathematics of statecraft, the most dangerous line item on a balance sheet is the cost of staying alive. We are taught to see the Praetorian Guard as the elite defenders of the Roman Emperor, but a forensic audit of their 300-year tenure reveals a much darker reality. They were the world's first private military company to successfully execute a hostile takeover of their own employer. While the legions on the frontiers were paid to expand the empire's borders, the Guard was paid to ensure the COOs' physical survival, a monopoly on violence that they quickly learned to monetize. This was not a story of military honor. It was a story of a security firm that realized it owned the board of directors and began liquidation proceedings on the state itself. This fundamental agency problem, where the interests of the agent diverged sharply from the interests of the principal, created a feedback loop of escalating costs and diminishing returns that would eventually hollow out the Roman treasury. To understand the collapse of the Roman state, one must first understand the security tax, a non-negotiable levy paid, not in grain or coin to the treasury, but in political autonomy and physical safety to a small, concentrated group of armed men. Augustus, in his attempt to solve the volatility of the late Republic, inadvertently created a permanent liability that no future emperor could ever fully amortize. By institutionalizing a permanent, high-cost security detail within the city limits, he introduced a predatory element into the very heart of the executive office, ensuring that every subsequent transition of power would be subject to the approval of a workforce with a zero-sum view of the empire's wealth. The Augustan settlement was, in corporate terms, the ultimate initial public offering, a moment where the chaotic, decentralized violence of the civil wars was consolidated into a single, high-leverage security contract. Augustus understood that his survival depended on an asymmetric distribution of force. He needed a body of men whose loyalty was not to the state or the law, but to his person, and he was willing to pay a massive premium to secure that loyalty. This created a profound pay disparity that would haunt the Roman budget for centuries, as a Praetorian was initially paid 750 denarii annually, a figure that was exactly triple the 225 denarii earned by a standard legionary on the frontier. From a management perspective, this was a retention bonus designed to prevent the elite security staff from being headhunted by rival political factions, but it also signaled to the rest of the military labor market that proximity to the CEO was far more valuable than actual production on the front lines. Furthermore, the Praetorians were granted a shorter term of service, 16 years compared to the 20 or 25 required of the legions, meaning the state was obligated to pay out massive severance packages or premia much more frequently to this elite group. This shorter amortization period for human capital meant that the Praetorian Guard was a constant drain on liquidity, requiring a dedicated revenue stream that Augustus eventually codified through the aeraria militare, a military treasury funded by a 5% inheritance tax and a 1% sales tax. By earmarking specific civilian taxes for military payouts, Augustus essentially created a security levy that redirected the productive surplus of the Roman economy into the pockets of his personal protectors. This was the birth of the donativum, a signing bonus given upon the accession of a new emperor, which functioned less as a gift and more as a recurring debt obligation that the state could never truly satisfy. The donativum established a dangerous precedent. The CEO did not inherit the company. They bought the right to manage it from the security firm that held the keys to the office. This initial contract was predicated on the assumption that the emperor could always out-earn the cost of his protection, a gamble that ignored the inevitable reality of diminishing tax bases and increasing military demands. As the years progressed, this IPO would be revealed as a predatory lending scheme, where the interest payments, the loyalty of the Guard, became so high that the state had to begin selling off its core assets just to keep the firm from foreclosing on the emperor's life. In the logic of market dominance, physical proximity to the consumer is the ultimate competitive advantage, a principle that Lucius Aelius Sejanus understood with a clarity that would eventually bankrupt the Roman political tradition. During the reign of Tiberius, the Praetorian Guard underwent a process of vertical integration and physical centralization that transformed them from a distributed security force into a concentrated monopoly. Before Sejanus, the cohorts were scattered throughout Rome and the surrounding Italian towns, a decentralized model that reduced the risk of a coordinated strike but increased operational overhead and slowed response times. Sejanus, acting as a shadow COO, convinced a weary and increasingly reclusive Tiberius to consolidate all 9 cohorts into a single, massive fortified headquarters, the Castra Praetoria. This move was framed as a logistical optimization to improve discipline and coordination, but in reality, it was a strategic move to reduce the emperor's exit options while maximizing the guard's leverage. By housing 9,000 elite troops in one office on the edge of the city, Sejanus effectively created a firewall between the emperor and the Senate, the people, and the provincial armies. This centralization allowed for the rapid deployment of force, yes, but it also meant that the Guard could now act as a single, unified bloc in any labor dispute or contract negotiation. The Castra Praetoria became the physical manifestation of an agency problem where the agent had successfully captured the principal's primary place of business. From this central hub, the Guard could control the flow of information, deciding who had access to the executive office and what intelligence reached the emperor's ears. This information asymmetry allowed Sejanus to manipulate the political market, purging rivals and consolidating power under the guise of protecting the CEO from internal threats. The cost of this centralization was the total loss of institutional transparency, as the emperor became a permanent hostage to his own proximity to the Guard. When Tiberius eventually retreated to the island of Capri, he left the firm in total control of the capital, effectively outsourcing the entire administrative and security apparatus to a group whose only incentive was the extraction of more dividends. This scaling of the monopoly meant that the Guard was no longer just a line item on the budget. They were the owners of the infrastructure of power itself. Any future attempt to downsize the Guard or reduce their pay would now be met with a unified, localized force that could decapitate the government in a matter of hours. The state had allowed its security provider to build a fortress inside the company's headquarters, and the lease was now written in blood, ensuring that any future emperor will be forced to pay an ever-increasing occupancy tax just to remain in the building. This consolidation was the final step in the transformation of the Guard from a protective service into a predatory entity, one that had successfully mapped the vulnerabilities of the Roman state and was now ready to begin the long, slow process of asset stripping. The security tax had become a protection racket, and the Roman Empire was about to learn that when you give a monopoly on violence to a single firm, the only thing they will eventually produce is a demand for higher payouts and more frequent management changes. This structural trap, set by Augustus and sprung by Sejanus, ensured that the Roman executive was no longer an office of leadership, but a position of high-risk debt management, where the primary objective was not the health of the empire, but the satisfaction of the firm's quarterly dividend expectations. In a rational market, a CEO is fired for poor performance. In the Roman Empire, the security firm fired the CEO to trigger a contractually mandated signing bonus. This systemic moral hazard meant that the protectors of the state were financially incentivized to maximize the frequency of executive turnover, effectively turning the assassination of an emperor into a high-yield liquidity event. When the Praetorian Guard liquidated Caligula in 41 AD, they were not acting out of a sense of democratic restoration or moral outrage, but were instead executing a forced buyout to reset their compensation structure under a new, more compliant successor. By selecting Claudius, a candidate who was physically intimidated and politically isolated, the Guard ensured a massive donativum of 15,000 sesterces per man, a sum that represented several years of standard wages delivered in a single lump sum. This created a perverse economic cycle where a long-reigning, stable emperor was a low-yield asset for the security force, whereas a rapid succession of short-lived rulers provided a recurring stream of massive accession dividends. The year of the four emperors in 69 AD serves as the ultimate forensic evidence of this market logic, as the Guard and the provincial armies realized that the Imperial office was a consumable resource that could be harvested for cash multiple times in a single fiscal year. Galba's fatal mistake was not his age or his policy, but his attempt to ignore the market rate for loyalty, famously stating that he chose his soldiers and did not buy them. A refusal to pay the expected bonus that led to his immediate termination by Otho. This period of hyper-liquidity for the military labor force resulted in total insolvency for the state, as the treasury was drained to satisfy the competing demands of various security factions, each demanding their own signing bonus for the same office. The agency problem had reached its logical conclusion. The agents had realized that their primary product was not protection, but permission to rule, and they were determined to sell that permission to as many buyers as possible in the shortest possible time frame. This cycle effectively turned the Imperial office into a toxic asset, a position of such extreme liability and high overhead that no sane administrator could manage it without facing the constant threat of immediate, violent liquidation. The economic volatility of this CEO replacement cycle eventually reached a point where the traditional mechanisms of political legitimacy were stripped away, leaving only the raw, transactional reality of the security contract. In 193 AD, the mask of statehood finally fell, revealing a raw, unregulated auction floor where the greatest empire on earth was sold to the highest bidder like a distressed warehouse lot. This event followed the assassination of Pertinax, an austerity CEO who had attempted to impose fiscal discipline on the Guard by auditing their perks and demanding a return to professional standards. Pertinax failed to understand that the Praetorian Guard was no longer a subsidiary of the state, but its primary creditor, and his attempt to claw back their inflated benefits was viewed as a breach of contract that warranted his immediate removal. Following his murder, the Guard did not even bother with the pretense of finding a qualified successor. Instead, they stood on the walls of the Castra Praetoria and announced that the Imperial office was for sale to whoever could provide the largest immediate cash injection. The resulting bidding war between Sulpicianus, the city prefect, and Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator, was a textbook example of market failure, where the price of the asset was driven not by its actual productive value, but by the desperate speculation of the bidders. Julianus eventually won the lot, with a bid of 25,000 sesterces per soldier, a staggering sum that totaled approximately 225 million sesterces for the entire Guard, a figure that exceeded the empire's immediate liquid reserves and required the new owner to begin a desperate search for capital. This was the ultimate leveraged buyout, where Julianus purchased a brand, the title of emperor, without having control over the operating assets, the provincial armies on the frontiers. The purchase was a failure from day one because the market participants in the provinces, the commanders of the legions in Pannonia, Syria, and Britain, immediately recognized that the Guard had overvalued their security monopoly and moved to devalue Julianus' purchase by declaring their own candidates. Julianus had bought a prestige asset that carried all the liabilities of the state's debt, but none of the actual power to enforce his ownership, as the provincial legions represented a competing labor force that was no longer willing to let the central office in Rome capture all the accession dividends. This auction signaled the end of the Praetorian Guard's exclusive control over the emperor market, as it invited a hostile takeover from the frontier legions who realized that if the throne was a commodity, they had the superior manufacturing capacity to produce their own emperors. The security monopoly of the Praetorians was broken, not by a return to civilian law, but by a wider competitive market of military violence where the operating costs of the empire would soon spiral beyond the capacity of any tax base to sustain. This collapse of institutional legitimacy meant that the Roman state was no longer a sovereign entity, but a distressed asset being fought over by various heavily armed private equity firms, each looking to extract the remaining value from the treasury before the entire structure inevitably defaulted on its obligations. The most powerful man in Rome was rarely the one wearing the purple. It was the man who controlled the gate to the room where the purple was kept. By the mid-2nd century, the office of the Praetorian prefect had evolved from a simple military command into the role of a shadow chief operating officer, a position that concentrated the empire's most vital logistical and informational pipelines into a single, unaccountable node. This was the ultimate realization of information asymmetry, where the prefect acted as a high-latency filter between the executive office and the reality of the provincial markets, ensuring that the emperor only received data that increased the prefect's own market value. Consider the tenure of Lucius Fulvius Plautianus under Septimius Severus, a man who managed to consolidate so much internal capital that his personal wealth eventually rivaled the imperial treasury itself. Plautianus did not merely manage the guard. He monetized the very concept of proximity by charging what was essentially an access fee to the senatorial class, a non-negotiable surcharge for anyone seeking an audience or a favorable ruling from the CEO. This security tax on the elite was not a formal levy, but a systemic extraction of rent that ensured the prefect was the primary beneficiary of every high-level transaction within the Roman state. Furthermore, the prefect has control over the annona, the grain supply for the capital, and the cursus publicus, the state's postal and intelligence network, meant that they held a total monopoly on the operating system of the empire. If a provincial governor in Gaul or Syria attempted to report corruption or bypass the guard's influence, the information COO could simply delay the message or lose the data in transit, effectively isolating the emperor in a bubble of curated misinformation. This logistical stranglehold meant that the firm was no longer just providing security. They were managing the entire flow of state assets and information to ensure their own continued dominance. This concentration of power within the urban center of Rome created a massive administrative overhead that diverted capital away from the productive frontiers and into the pockets of a localized, unproductive elite. The logistics of the guard, combined with the urban cohorts, functioned as a protection racket on a metropolitan scale, holding the capital's economy hostage to ensure that their dividends were always the first priority on the state's balance sheet. If the emperor or the senate attempted to reduce the guard's pay or audit their perks, the firm could simply stop the flow of grain from the docks at Ostia, triggering immediate civil unrest and forcing the executive to capitulate. This urban control was not a military strategy, but a supply chain hijack that leveraged the vulnerability of a highly centralized city against the long-term health of the broader empire. The recurring cost of maintaining this elite security force, which was paid 3 times the rate of frontier labor for a fraction of the actual production, led to a hollow state infrastructure where the core was wealthy and well-defended, while the periphery was chronically underfunded. Every denarius spent on a Praetorian bonus was a denarius not spent on a bridge in Dacia or a fortification on the Rhine, a misallocation of resources that slowly eroded the empire's operating assets. The prefects like Perennis or Cleander under the reign of Commodus took this extraction to its logical extreme, selling off governorships and judicial decisions to the highest bidder, effectively turning the Roman state into a liquidating trust, where the goal was to extract as much cash as possible before the inevitable bankruptcy. This recursive cycle of corruption and extraction increased the cost of governance to a point where the tax base could no longer support the weight of its own security apparatus, creating a systemic risk that would eventually trigger a total market collapse. By the time the 3rd century arrived, the Praetorian Guard had successfully captured the board of directors and was actively stripping the company of its remaining value, leaving the Roman state as a debt-ridden shell of its former self. Every Ponzi scheme eventually runs out of new investors, and by the 4th century, the Roman Empire could no longer afford the interest payments on its own survival. The 3rd century crisis had already exposed the terminal insolvency of the Augustan model, as a century of hyperinflation and currency debasement had rendered the traditional security contract practically worthless in real terms. The Guard demanded more silver to offset the rising costs of living in the capital. But because the state had no new revenue streams from conquest, it was forced to debase the denarius, leading to a wage price spiral that destroyed the purchasing power of the entire military labor market. By the time of the Tetrarchy, the empire had been forced to restructure its debt by splitting into 4 administrative units, a move that was intended to reduce the leverage of the Roman base guard by creating new regional offices with their own localized security forces. However, the Praetorian Guard, unwilling to accept a downsizing of their influence or reduction in their urban dividends, made one final, desperate play for market dominance by backing Maxentius in 306 AD. This was not a political movement, but a hostile takeover attempt by a legacy firm trying to maintain its monopoly against a leaner, more efficient competitor emerging from the frontier. Maxentius transformed Rome into a fortified corporate headquarters, betting that the Guard's traditional urban leverage could withstand the merger by force being spearheaded by Constantine, who represented the operating divisions of the Gallic and British legions. This conflict culminated in the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, an event that serves as a forensic case study in logistical failure and the decay of core competencies. The Guard's performance at the Milvian Bridge revealed the total productivity collapse of a security firm that had spent 3 centuries focusing on extortion rather than actual combat. Despite having the home field advantage and superior numbers, the Praetorians had become rent-seekers who were more skilled at political assassination and urban control than large-scale field maneuvers against a battle-hardened frontier army. Maxentius' decision to leave the safety of the Aurelian walls and engage Constantine's leaner forces on the open ground was a catastrophic management error, likely driven by the need to demonstrate the Guard's market relevance to a skeptical Roman public. When the Guard's lines broke, the very infrastructure they had relied on for their urban monopoly, the bridges and the narrow corridors of the Tiber, became a bottleneck that facilitated their own destruction. Constantinus' victory was the final liquidation of the Praetorian model, and he wasted no time in executing a total corporate dissolution of the firm that had held the state hostage for 300 years. He did not merely fire the employees. He physically dismantled the Castra Praetoria, the server farm of their power, and ordered the remaining soldiers to be reassigned to the frontier branch offices, where their political leverage was zero. This was a restructuring plan that finally ended the security monopoly of the capital, moving the center of power to a new headquarters in Constantinople, far from the toxic influence of the old Roman security elite. The dissolution of the Guard was a recognition that a state cannot survive when its primary security provider becomes its primary predator, consuming the very capital it was hired to protect. The final balance sheet of the Praetorian Guard experiment reveals a staggering total cost of ownership that the Roman Empire was never truly able to amortize. Over 3 centuries, the security tax had slowly consumed the principal of the empire's wealth, leaving a hollowed-out shell that was increasingly vulnerable to foreign competitors and internal decay. The empire did not fall to barbarians in a single moment of catastrophic failure. It was liquidated because it could no longer pay the firm that was supposed to protect it, and the restructuring attempts by later emperors were too little, too late to save the original business model. The Praetorian Guard had successfully executed the longest hostile takeover in human history, but in doing so, they destroyed the very asset they sought to control, proving that a monopoly on violence is a self-liquidating investment. When Constantine marched the last of the Praetorians out of Rome, he was not just ending a military unit. He was closing the books on a 300-year agency problem that had turned the world's greatest superpower into a bankrupt protection racket. The cold ledger of history shows that the Guard's primary legacy was not the defense of the emperor, but the systematic extraction of state wealth, a negative ROI that ensured the eventual collapse of the Roman executive office. The dividend of blood had finally been paid in full, and the state was left with nothing but the toxic debt of its own history. A warning to all future civilizations about the dangers of allowing a security subsidiary to become the owner of the state. In the end, the Praetorian Guard did not save Rome. They simply owned it until there was nothing left to sell, a final market failure that marked the end of the ancient world's most ambitious corporate experiment. The state had survived its enemies, but it could not survive its own close protection contract, proving that the most expensive line item on any balance sheet is the price of a protector who knows they are more powerful than the person they are protecting.